Hello. Today we will be discussing the age of absolute monarchs in Europe. Absolute monarchs are basically monarchs that have complete or total control, so as you can see here, a king or possibly a queen. Absolutism was a time period basically between the 1500s and 1600s. Mostly in Europe, but also in Asia, people, kings and queens, were attempting to make their power centralized, meaning have all the power under them. They did this many ways. Number one would be they claimed divine right, which meant that their power came from God. Now, everyone was very religious during this time period, so this was a good way to get people to believe that the king or the queen was an absolute monarch. And the two main monarchs we will be discussing are Louis XIV in France and also the monarchy in England. England is a little bit different because they, at the end of this, you will see that they don't have an absolute monarchy, but a monarchy that has a limited power. So France and England have opposite types of monarchies. All right, so these are a few main ideas you might want to know about absolutism. Number one is that monarchs acted to establish absolute power, meaning that they wanted to have complete and total control over the land that they controlled. So they wanted to make sure that they could tell anybody that they controlled what to do, and divine right was one of the ways they were able to do that. So that meant that they could justify their power by saying it came from God. Because remember, everyone's very religious, so they want to be able to prove that God has granted this absolute monarch their power. In England, we have what they call a parliament, which is very similar to the United States Congress. It's a group that makes laws. And in England, they have a parliament and also this group called the Puritans, who are a religious group. They are Christians who want to purify the church. These are people who did not like absolutism, especially parliament, because if there is an absolute monarch, the parliament is not needed and would be destroyed. England will try to make a limited monarchy, which means that the power is shared between a king or a monarch and the parliament. So the parliament would make the laws and the king would enforce or judge them. Okay, so just a quick definition of absolutism. It is a belief that monarchs hold supreme power and are responsible only to God. So no one could challenge them. Didn't matter what they wanted to do. If they wanted to do it, the only one that could stop them was God, because that's who they claimed by divine right gave them the power to rule. The king has all the power, people have no power. This is why this is kind of an unpopular method of rule, because the people want to have a say in their government, and the king would not allow it. And again, divine right is the idea that the king or queen gets their authority to rule directly from God. It was kind of hard to challenge this since everyone believed in this religion, and everyone was very religious at this time, and they believed in their king, so they didn't challenge this idea of divine right, even though it is tough to prove either way, that God has or has not given the king the right to rule. It's tough to prove that. So the idea is that kings would gain power and centralized governments would lose power. So this is very different than the government we have today in the United States. People had no rights and only the king had complete control. There are a few ways that monarchs would centralize their power, and these are very important that you know these. Number one, they would take control of religion. This is what we've already discussed with divine right. They would claim that their power came from God, and they would say then that they are the only ones who can speak to God, and therefore those governments are religious and cannot be challenged if you are a religious person. Number two is once they got control of the church, they would take control of the military so that they could protect themselves from anyone who wished to challenge them having absolute power or divine right. Number three would be once they had control of the church and the military, they would gain more territory. So they would go out into a new land, and with their new military that they've grown and made very strong, they would go out and gain more territory. The reason they wanted more territory is because they could tax these people to make more money, which is number 4. Absolute monarchs wanted to have a great deal of money, so they would trade and grow their wealth. That is called mercantilism, and the definition is right there. You can see it. It says owning colonies to get natural resources from and sell products to. So they would go out and conquer new territory, and they would look for places that have natural resources, so cotton or oil or coal or something like that, and they would take those natural resources back to their homeland, produce it into some sort of product. So cotton, they would make shirts or textiles, and then they would sell it back to that colony. So this is where we start getting colonies like the English colonies in the United States, or the French colonies in the Caribbean or in Canada. Okay, so let's talk specifics. Number 1 is France. France will become the most powerful nation in the world right after Spain falls in about the late 1600s, so about 1680, 1690, and they will have an absolute monarch named Louis XIV. And you can see Louis here. Louis rules France, and he is very interesting because he rules for 72 years. The reason for that is he actually becomes king at the age of 4. Now, he's not really king. He doesn't really make decisions yet. He has someone who kind of helps him out, a man named Cardinal Armand Richelieu, but you don't really need to know more than that. So he rules for a very long time. He will call himself the Sun King. That is because the sun is an object that represents a lot of power. It also represents life because the sun provides photosynthesis for plants. So he wanted to basically be saying, if without me, France cannot survive. He also famously said that I am the state, that the government does not exist without him. And as most absolute monarchs, the first thing he does is he strengthens his own power. He expands something called the bureaucracy, which is basically the government officials and things like that under Louis. And he will build a wonderful, beautiful palace at Versailles that I'll show you pictures of shortly. He will make France the strongest country in Europe in terms of their military, and he will use that to go out and claim territories like New France, which is in Canada, and get the fur trade going with the Native Americans. And he will make France a wealthy cultural center, so all the best art, music, clothing, wine, food was coming out of France at this time. However, Louis does not do everything correctly. He will use his wealth for his own benefit, so he will tax the people and not allow them to even visit Versailles. He will use all that money for Versailles, and it's not really a good use of wealth. His peasants would be starving, and he would be having these lavish parties at the palace, and it really didn't look very good. It didn't end very well. He will try to expand his territory and will have a lot of wars. Unfortunately, these wars didn't always end well and would cost a lot of money. He also never called something called the Estates General, because in France there were 3 estates, which we'll learn about more when we discuss the French Revolution. And all these problems could have been solved if he called the estates together and asked them, how can we solve this? And he didn't do that. The French monarchy would not survive long after Louis's death because he did not very much set them up for success. And these are just some pictures of what Versailles would look like. So we had many, many, many statues surrounding the palace. And this is one of the main entrances to the palace. You can see a lot of gold in here and all this wonderful glass. And the designs here are very, very expensive. Another statue and one of his many fountains that he had running water put in. This is one of the many hallways with beautiful art lining the hallways. Again, lots of money spent, and this was the taxpayers' money, not Louis'. Okay? This table is made out of solid gold. You can see all the walls, how they have gold in them. Again, not Louis' money, very expensive. Same thing here, the marble engraving, the gold around it. One of his many other hallways with the chandeliers, the gold in the walls, the mirrors. And then when you see this gold fireplace, one of his many bedrooms. And Louis would have these wonderful gardens that had to be very, very meticulously taken care of, and you can see all the very interesting designs that he had in these gardens. So this costs a lot of money to have people plant them, but then also maintain them and keep them very nice. Another one of his beautiful hallways with the art on the ceiling and the gold in the doors. And then finally, this could be an interesting picture of his grandfather clock. Again, solid gold, very, very expensive. Okay, so those are some examples of Louis and France. Now let's switch gears to absolutism in England, which will be quite different. And you can see over here we have some English monuments like Big Ben, which is a very nice clock tower attached to the Parliament building. So other nations are trying to be absolute monarchs. England will have a parliament that is very strong and will stop this from happening. So one of the first kings to kind of challenge the parliament is a man named James I, and he rules from 1603 to 1625. Okay, he is very famous for creating the King James version of the Bible, which he will translate into English. Okay, however, he has many downfalls. He, as I said, will have challenges with Parliament. He will need money to have his extravagant lifestyle and many wars that he will engage in paid for. And Parliament doesn't necessarily want to give him the money, so he tries to become an absolute monarch by dissolving Parliament, and he will make his own taxes to pay for this. He will seek to fight with Puritans, who's that religious group who was trying to purify the church, and eventually these will be people who are going to fight back against him. So after James, we have Charles I, and after James changed all those things and got rid of Parliament, Charles is going to have to deal with what happened. So he rules from 1625 to 1649. His achievements are that he grows the English army and will, again, seize a lot of areas for England to make colonies and to expand that mercantilism. However, he will make enemies with the Puritans because he will impose high taxes, just like his father. He will not be very nice to them. He will continue to have Parliament be dissolved and will only call them back when he needs money to pay for his wars. They didn't really appreciate this, and this will lead to something called the English Civil War. And this is between the monarch, Charles I, and a man named Oliver Cromwell. And Oliver Cromwell is the leader of the Puritans, and he will not want to have England become an absolute monarchy. And eventually, he will have Charles lose his head. So Cromwell will be successful, and this is a picture actually from London, where on one side of the street we see Charles with his head only being displayed because he will be defeated in the English Civil War, and he will lose his head. And on the other side of the street, the English have put Oliver Cromwell, and you can see it shows his full body, his military sword, but also his Bible because he is a very Puritan man. And so the English have a bit of a sense of humor about this. However, after a while, people grow tired of the Puritan rule because they don't like drinking or partying or theater, so they try to get rid of all that, and people get tired of that under Cromwell and ask a man named Charles II to come to kind of take the throne and lead England again. So he rules from 1660 to 1685, and he's asked to take the throne again to get rid of the Puritans. So he is kind of a good time king. He opens theaters. He allows dancing and music back in London and England. However, he will obey Parliament and will allow England to be a limited monarchy, and he will have limited power. That was okay with him because he saw what happened to Charles I, and he lost his head, and he didn't want to have that happen. So a limited monarchy is another vocabulary word you're going to want to know. Limited monarchy is a government in which the legislative body limits the monarch's power. So again, we still have a king, but he doesn't have as much power as he would have if he was an absolute monarch. After Charles II, we have James II. James II doesn't follow Charles's lead and will actually try to create an absolute monarchy in England. He wants that. He is defeated after when he tries this, and his daughter, Mary, and her husband, William, will be asked to come and take the throne. And so James will flee because he doesn't want to have his head chopped off. So he runs away, and the English Civil War is completed by William and Mary taking the throne. And this is called the Glorious Revolution. The only difference is they had to sign the English